Hello, this is UATV. I'm Henry Keane. Today we're trying to find at least some sense in a mess of nowadays international politics, talking to an expert. His work focuses on US support for Ukraine, particularly in American Congress. His research includes Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration, authoritarianism in Russia, and transatlantic security. He frequently writes for US media and has been interviewed by news outlets such as CNN, BBC, and Politico, and today, UATV. Hello, Mr. Klain. Sir, thank you so very much for joining.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. First things first, the United States and China. All right, Trump and Xi Jinping. Is that a siege of sorts? And who sieges who here, do you think?
Well, it's an interesting situation. Of course, for months now, President Donald Trump has been courting Xi Jinping in a way, hoping to strike some kind of a grand bargain. We've seen opening shots of a potential trade war with, of course, these massive tariffs that the U.S. has variously leveled against China.
Right.
But today we have big news coming out of this meeting between these world leaders that the U.S. and China seem to have struck some kind of a deal to hold back on export controls of Chinese rare earths and for the United States to hold back or at least dial back its tariffs on China.
Right, well, you said trade war. Is that just a trade war, or there is a chance, any chance that it could be a real war turn out somehow between China and the United States, or you don't believe that?
Well, that's one of the big risks and fears here in Washington. For years now, the United States and defense planners have worried about the risk of a potential war with China, likely sparked over China's plans to potentially try to take Taiwan by force. That is a scenario that U.S. military planners are planning for right now. And so that's something that I think is certainly driving a lot of this U.S. policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you believe that Ukraine is on a table of negotiation as an object of a trade between the United States and China?
You know, from the reporting that we've seen today of these talks between Trump and Xi, it doesn't seem like Ukraine came up all that much. Now, China's role in supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine has, of course, been a topic here in Washington. There's even legislation in Congress to sanction China for its involvement in the war. That legislation has moved a bit in recent weeks,
Right.
but I think that legislators aren't expecting to vote on it anytime soon.
Well, some experts say that we are a part of a deal, but what can Ukraine do to prevent being a collateral in a bargain between Washington and Beijing? Is there anything?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the biggest things that Ukraine, of course, has to do is solidify its own defense. One of the vulnerabilities that Ukraine has is its reliance on Chinese components for building
Right.
Ukrainian drones, especially FPV drones. That's one of the big efforts that I know is underway in the Ukrainian defense industry to try to de-risk from China to produce more components there in Ukraine, as well as to try to strike deals with the US and Europe to try to lower costs and decrease export controls on Western components to try to de-risk a bit from China. That, of course, is, I think, one of these big priorities.
Big priorities. And if I say that for the moment, at the moment, right now, the United States lacks leverage and tools over Chinese effort to support Russian military aggression in Ukraine, would I be right, you think?
Well, the United States absolutely has tools to influence Chinese behavior and Chinese support for Russia. The question is, will the United States use them? There's been a
Right.
big debate over sanctions here, of course, in Washington. The big piece of legislation that U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham has introduced to sanction
Right.
Russia over its support for over its war. There's secondary sanctions in that would also sanction China for its support. But of course, there hasn't been as much interest from the Trump administration
Right.
in trying to sanction China over this, especially as it's trying to strike other deals. Some of these sanctions would contradict the deals that Trump is striking. And so that's one of the reasons why I think there hasn't been as much interest in going after it.
Thank you. Really a detailed answer. Let's talk about that show-off that Putin is throwing. Putin shows off. I mean, Thunderbird. Poseidon underwater drone, both nuclear powered, both unparalleled in our galaxy. Putin talks to wounded soldiers in a Russian hospital. War is on Russian genes, a full spectrum of morbid schizophrenia delusions, if you ask me. Yet, all that military party thrown, is that a sign of strength, do you think? Or other way around?
Well, at times it almost feels like the height of the Cold War, with countries trying to,
Yes.
show off how great their nuclear arsenals are and how much damage could be inflicted. Of course, there's a pattern that we've seen from Moscow over the last couple of years, using its nuclear arsenal as this kind of saber to rattle and threaten
Right,
Ukraine's
right.
backers. It was somewhat successful in trying to deter the United States under Joe Biden from giving as much support to Ukraine as perhaps it should have. And it's, of course, a tactic that Vladimir Putin is trying to use again against Donald Trump. Trump's concerns about nuclear annihilation, I think, are well reported. And it's a fear that Putin is trying to play off of. Now, of course, at times, these threats, as we've seen from people like Dmitry Medvedev, have sparked, it seems, the opposite reaction from Trump, dispatching U.S. nuclear submarines to threaten Russia in turn. And so, of course, I think that Putin may find himself in new territory with Trump. He's somewhat less predictable, as we've seen, than past U.S. leaders.
What do you think? If United States are to sanction Russia, I mean, if these sanctions are going to target its nuclear sector, would that be a right step to take?
Absolutely. I refer back again to that sanctions legislation from Lindsey Graham, which does contain, in addition to sanctions on
Right.
Russian
Okay.
oil,
Right.
sanctions on Russian nuclear energy, and that is another key component to try to go after, Russia's war effort. As especially as Russia is escalating its nuclear saber rattling, I think we're going to see more and more interest from policymakers here in Washington in trying to contain Russia's nuclear escalation.
Yeah, I believe you're absolutely right. I can't agree more with that. But next question is, I was born and raised in Europe, in Baltic states, Latvia. So it is a very important question to me personally. Russian missiles and drones over NATO, all of Poland, Romania, Baltic states. Belgian defense minister says Moscow could be wiped off the face of the earth, right? All that said, do you believe, sir, that NATO will use force in response when it comes to that? I repeat my question. Not is NATO just capable of using force? It is capable, we know that. But will it be actually applying that force? Do we have what it takes?
That is the key question. After the meetings at the United Nations General Assembly a couple weeks ago, it seemed like there was the political will to strike these Russian drones and perhaps fighter jets if they come back into NATO airspace. Now, of course, there have been incursions since then, not, it seems, to the scale of what we saw in Poland with those dozens of drones, or of the multiple Russian fighter jets that were in Estonian airspace for, I think, 13 minutes. But I think that more and more we're seeing these discussions from NATO leaders on what is the threshold at which point
Exactly.
their air defenses need to take down these Russian raids really into NATO airspace. If we get to the point where there is something as egregious as what we saw in Poland before, I think we're more likely to see NATO forces trying to down these Russian aircraft. Of course, we do see some differences between these drone incursions and the fighter jets. We've seen Russian jets going into NATO airspace, buzzing seacraft
Right.
for years, and that is a kind of threat that NATO forces are more prepared to handle. They understand how to navigate some of those situations a bit better. Even so, I think there is growing appetite for a show of force.
Right. Well, Mr. Klein, you were talking about what is the threshold? What is the American threshold? How should the United States respond to systematic drone provocations, let's call a spade, and cyber sabotage, just by the way, incidents in the Europe, and it's escalating. So what is the threshold? When the time comes, it's not yet.
Well, I think the threshold is going to be different for European states and the United States. The US,
Okay.
as we've seen, has a much more complicated tolerance for Russian provocations under the Trump administration. We've seen the US dial back, for example, its offensive cyber operations against Russia during this administration. And so much of US policy towards Russia here is about how can President Trump try to convince Vladimir Putin to make peace, to negotiate. And oftentimes we're seeing him try to dial back the pressure on Russia in order to convince Putin to try to dial back his own provocations and aggression. That strategy has not yielded real results, of course. And so I think that's one of the big reasons why there is more appetite in the rest of Europe for trying to take down
Right.
these Russian jets and show force against those provocations. I think that's the question of where can these European states take action and when are they ready to do
Right.
so without the explicit backing of the United States, which
Okay.
may not happen.
True, true. And I mean, that's all about the escalation, but everyone talks about that escalation. I'm here in Ukraine for 4 years already. I've witnessed it all. I mean, with my own eyes, colleagues and friends wounded and dead. So I see Russia is escalating in Ukraine. Should the United States, you think, strengthen air defense, for example, in Europe to avoid escalation? Just air defense. I know Europe should be acting on its own, but what about the air defense? Air defense, I know the United States is absolutely capable of doing that like this.
You're 100% correct. The United States absolutely should be strengthening air defense as well as other forces stationed on NATO's eastern flank, as well as strengthening Ukraine's air defense. Ukraine is, of course, the front line of defense for Europe. And the extent to which the United States and other allies can invest more in Ukraine's indigenously produced air defense, such as these interceptor drones, for example, that's something that not only strengthens Ukraine's ability to hamper Russia's air attacks, but also can lead to dividends for NATO as a whole by having these kinds of co-production deals with Ukraine. It's something that's squarely in our interest to help Ukraine in this way. And I think that's a very powerful argument here in Washington. It's one that we're making certainly much more nowadays.
Right. Well, different countries, different culture, different situation, absolutely, economically, politically, militarily, the United States and Europe, all sorts of problems. I understand, but will we ever see, you think, let's call it synchronization between European and American tough rhetoric, not talking about even the actions against the Kremlin, the rhetoric, will we ever be united, or it's impossible under Trump?
Well, ultimately, we're asking, will Trump's rhetoric align with European leaders? And
Right,
that's a question that I can't
right,
answer
right,
because, of course, so much of what the United States does, well, so much of its foreign policy, especially, is purely the domain of Donald Trump nowadays. Congress does still have a role, and of course, there are many strong pro-Ukraine voices there, but there's a lot of deference to Trump on this. One week, it can be quite strong when he's saying that Ukraine could take back all of its territory. Another week, he's saying that Russia's going to win no matter what. And so ultimately, it's a question that I can't answer. Though,
right.
of course, I think that we've seen a pretty clear pattern that the more European leaders come to Donald Trump and tell him we've got a plan, please stick with us on
Stick with
this,
us, right.
that tends to lead to some better results from Trump himself.
I mean, isn't it a crazy thing to hear from an expert? Congress in America still plays some role. I mean, that's something. But all right,
You're
let's.
absolutely right. I
I
mean,
mean,
that's part
it's
of the system here.
just another executive order and goodbye. Yeah. Right.
No, I mean
Okay.
you're absolutely right. It's a remarkable thing. I mean, Congress has
It
sanctions
is.
legislation with overwhelming support, and yet it's still waiting for this kind of explicit green light from Trump. It can mandate that sanctions are passed against Russia, and yet there's very little legislation that would force Trump to act. So much of it is how can we suggest to him, push him to try to take some kind of an action
Right.
without requiring him to do so. That's one of the real contradictions in our system right now.
Always thought that the green light is a green light. It can't get more explicit, but the reality shows otherwise. All right. So if I walk into a book, let's talk about Europe. If I walk into a bookstore in 10 years from now, I can see on a bestseller shelf a book, How to Blackmail Europe and Get Away with It, Viktor Orban. Is there a way Europe can actually avoid political blackmailing these days within its own family? I mean, be it Orban or Fico or Sciarto or anybody else, do you think it's possible?
Well, I think Viktor Orban couldn't just write a book on it; he could write a series of books on it. No, this is something that we've absolutely seen, and
TV show.
it we have we've also seen from the EU, for example, some real frustration, of course, with Hungary and its, for example, vetoing and threats to veto sanctions packages against Russia. Every time that Hungary keeps pushing like this, the EU, I think, is getting more tired of, let's call it bribes, money to give to Hungary and donations there to try to get Hungary back on board with a sanctions package. But we're seeing real exasperation, I think, with that cycle. And every time that Hungary is threatening to veto sanctions packages again, we see more and more talk in Brussels and other European capitals that perhaps we need to find a mechanism to move forward without unanimous consent from all of the EU member states. And so I think that there is this threshold that Hungary is trying to figure out how far can we go without
How
going over the
low?
line that we lose our voting rights.
How low can we go? I mean, and don't get me wrong, I absolutely, yeah, you're right. Yeah, we're seeing talks in Brussels every time he blackmails Europe, but he still does. And all right, that's a topic of a different conversation for hours, of course, and we both understand that there is no clear and firm answer to that. But Russian assets. Mr. Klain, do you believe that will they ever be actually confiscated, actually, from the perpetrator of this terrible war and released in favor of victim of this war, Ukraine?
I think it will happen. You mentioned, of course, earlier the Belgian defense minister making some interesting threats against Russia. Of course, if Belgium wanted to take real action against Russia, these Russian state assets, more than 190 billion euros worth, are sitting there in Euroclear right now. Taking those would be a serious action to support Ukraine and
Exactly.
push back against Russian aggression. Now, we have seen real progress, of course. This 140 billion euro loan from Europe to Ukraine is a big deal. Giving Ukraine that
It
kind
is.
of predictable financial support for years to come, that is something that signals resolve from Europe and real support for Ukraine and can really do quite a lot to help. But of course, it is different from transferring the actual principle of these assets
Mm,
to some kind of a Ukraine support fund to make sure that no matter what, they are not going back to Russia. And every 6 months, we talk about the EU sanctions packages. They come up for renewal every 6 months. Every 6 months, a Hungarian veto risks unfreezing those assets and allowing Russia to take them back. That's a
right,
risk that we
right,
face
right.
every 6 months. And so trying to actually transfer these assets permanently to make sure that if Russia does not pay the reparations that it owes to Ukraine, and I don't think that any of us have really intense hopes that Russia is going to pay reparations to Ukraine anytime
Nope.
soon, transferring these assets is a way to make up for some shred of the massive damages that
Massive
Russia
damage
has
indeed.
inflicted against Ukraine. It's a pretty clear case under international law. Here in the United States, there's actually legislation that's moving through
Mm,
Congress right now that would mandate Donald Trump transfers the more than 5 billion in Russian assets in the United States to support Ukraine. We, of course, passed legislation on this last year, but Biden didn't implement it, and Trump hasn't implemented it yet. So
yes,
we're
right.
waiting to see if this new legislation passes through, which would actually mandate Trump to implement this legislation to transfer the assets.
And while we all are waiting, what do you think about this peace plan of 12 points? Is that viable? European plan. Have you heard of it? I believe you heard of it, right?
It's not a bad plan, of course. I think that the core principle that must be pushed, though, is enabling Ukraine to guarantee its security. We've seen that there's no better military in Europe and no better force that is ready to stand up against Russian aggression than Ukraine. And so, getting Ukraine all of the military assistance, financial assistance that it needs to defend itself, as well as the significant political backing and oversight over time, hopefully, European soldiers in Ukraine supporting Ukraine directly. These are all things that can help lead to what is hopefully a durable
Right.
and real peace that isn't going to be violated at the first opportunity.
Durable and firm peace. Last question for tonight. Mr. Klain, do you believe that when that peace comes, in any time soon, or maybe later on, Russia will change to the better?
I don't think that Russia's going to change anytime soon. We've seen Russian society, I think, change quite a lot over the last few decades, and especially in recent years. Let's call a spade a spade. Fascism has gripped Russian society. Russian society is built around waging war right now, currently against Ukraine, but with the intention of going further. And unless Russia is truly decisively defeated, I don't see a real hope for some kind of a change to sweep Russian society and purge this fanaticism that has taken hold, this zeal for warfighting. If Russia is given some kind of a fake peace that can be easily violated in the near future, that I think will only reinforce for certainly for Russia's leadership the rightness of this path. That if they keep pushing, if they keep up this aggression, Western democracies aren't strong enough, aren't steely enough to hold it back, to take a stand against it. They'll try to cut a bad deal and just kick the can down the road. Only, I think, a real defeat against Russia gives us a hope of genuine change in Russian society. And I don't see that coming in the very near future, but I do hope that we see that.
Well, Mr. Klain, that makes it you and me and at least 40 million Ukrainian hearts that agree with you firmly. Thank you so very much for your expertise, for your time, for what you do for Ukraine, and for your hopes. Thank you. I'm Henry Keane, and we just talked to Doug Klain, US policy expert and Ukraine Deputy Director for Policy at Razom for Ukraine, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and I hope you found the conversation interesting. Follow us, UATV, and stay tuned for more. Cheers.